In looking at Gustafson's essay, Grief, let's jump right into the middle of things. We'll work our way back to the beginning of the essay and review some of the things that lead up to this. But I'm starting here in section 3, which is on page 463 of his essay. This is the heart of the essay, the most important part of the essay, and everything before it leads up to it is an introduction to it, and everything after the introduction of this definition G, his definition of grief, everything after is an explanation or a defense of the definition. But I thought it would be good to start right here and then look at those other things. This is his definition of grief. Grief is a belief of the form that P and attendant feelings, such as feelings of loss, pain, anger, fear, distress, and unhappiness, and a desire of the form that not P in a whole psychological context. Really, we want to appreciate, we want to understand the whole of Gustafson's essay, but we can't understand any of it until we understand the components of his definition of grief. And the important thing to start with, I think, is that there are 3 components, and they all go together to form what he believes is the distinct emotional state called grief. First of all, grief is a belief. That's the cognitive part, the so-called cognitive part. Grief is a belief of the form that P, and P can be P is just a stand-in for any proposition or any statement, any claim. P is some claim about the world, and importantly, he'll say that it's not just any statement. That very specific kinds of statements or really specific kinds of belief are the cognitive or belief component of G, of grief. But that's the first part. The first is a belief part, the cognitive part, a belief that P. And P is, as we quickly find out, P is satisfied by a proposition or statement or sentence to the effect that a person is dead, has died, or has been almost certainly lost or permanently separated from the agent whose grief is under consideration. So it doesn't appear that specifically in the definition, but P stands for basically the statement that someone has died or someone has been lost. So the first component of G is a cognitive component, a belief component, a belief that something is true. So grief is a belief of the form that P and attendant feelings, such as feelings of loss, pain, anger, fear, distress, and unhappiness. So that's the second component, the attendant feelings. Right. So grief has a belief component, what he calls the cognitive component, and it has the feeling component. That is the second element, second component of being in grief or grieving is having a certain feeling. And he's necessarily, I think, kind of loose about that. What kind of feeling are we talking about? Loss, pain, anger, fear, distress, and unhappiness. Negative feelings of sadness, basically, sorrow. Which can take different forms or have certain related feelings. Anger is certainly different. Fear is certainly different. But pain, I think, suffering, a negative state. So whatever the feeling component is, it's kind of loosely defined here so that it allows for all sorts of different associated, varied feelings that we have when we grieve, but all of them negative, and all of them in some way or another being painful feelings of distress, feelings of suffering, feelings of sadness or unhappiness. So the first component is the belief component, the cognitive component, the belief that P or that someone close to you has died. The second is the feeling component, the feelings of sadness, the feelings of loss, pain, anger, distress, longing, that go along with that are a part of the experience. And finally, the third part, the desire part. Grief is a belief of the form that P and attendant feelings, such as feelings of loss, pain, anger, fear, distress, and unhappiness, and a desire of the form that not P in a whole psychological context. So we can ignore that last part. It doesn't really add very much to it. It's really this part that's crucial. And in fact, is the whole point of his essay, and is what he has to add, is really the subject of his idea. The really important part of his idea, what's really novel in this, is the desire part. So the third element here is a desire. What's a desire? A wanting, a craving, maybe, an urgent desire, an urgent wanting. But a wanting of a particular form, he says, of the form that not P. You can see right away what this does and how this makes his definition much more interesting. That is, the form of the desire is a desire that contradicts the belief. Right? If the belief we have, the belief we start with, is the belief that someone has died, that's what P is in this context, then the desire that we have when we grieve is for the opposite to be true, that not P. This is why I want to start here with the definition G, so we get a sense of, what he's getting at, what's really the most distinctive part of his essay and his idea about grief, and what's really, I think, interesting in his definition of grief, is that obviously any definition of grief would have to talk about the feelings. And he does loosely talk about the kind of feelings we have when we grieve. And it maybe is a little less obvious, but makes absolute sense that grief is also has a belief component. I mean, we grieve primarily when we believe that someone has died, when we're under the impression that someone has died. And usually, of course, our belief is true, but he wants to put this in sort of a subjective context. So he talks about the belief we have that someone has died. So far, kind of okay. Belief is about feeling sadness or pain or distress. And we grieve when we have a belief that someone has died. That's what P is here. But crucially, for his definition, when we grieve, we have a desire that what we believe to be true not be true. That is, that we have a desire which is in conflict with our belief, that we want something to be true that we know is not true. That's what's really interesting. And this is what I found interesting about this essay and why I've given it to you. Right now, we have to go back to this in our discussion, but again, in explicating his definition G here on page 464, P, remember P is the proposition, right? That P. P is satisfied, that is, P can be replaced with a proposition or statement or sentence to the effect that a certain person is dead, usually a person who's close to us, right? And we skip ahead here. I'm on page 465. Right, and then he moves on to explicating the feeling part of it. But then he realizes that the most interesting thing that he said is about the desire part of it. This is again on page 465. He says the most contentious condition in G, his definition of grief, is the condition I will call the counter-belief desire. And that's how he characterizes the desire component of his notion of grief, is that it's counter-belief. That is, that the desire what you want, runs counter to and contradicts what you believe to be true. And that's, again, what I find to be the most interesting aspect of it, and what gives his definition of grief a kind of real substance, or a kind of a really interesting aspect, insofar as what he has suggested is that to really be grieving, to really be in a state of grief, that you must want or desire something that you know cannot be gotten. That is, you desire something to be true. You have a desire for something, and really for someone, that you know cannot be fulfilled. That rationally, you are aware that, again, the belief component, that someone has died. But to really be grieving, despite your belief that someone has died, you must have a desire, and we'll talk more about the particulars of what he means by desire, but you must have a desire that they be alive. And so this really makes, I think, the definition interesting, because it suggests something very interesting about grief, that to be grieving is to be in a state of internal contradiction, to be in a state of internal conflict. And he suggests that conflict is between what we want, what we desire, and what we know to be true. So I just wanted to get that out there right away. So before we get maybe lost in some of the details of his presentation, to get that out there, that's really what I think is really interesting about his idea about grief.